Hi everyone. So I haven't been here the whole time, so I might kind of cover some things again. I mean, it's nice that this moves around. Um, Basically, what I hope to do is kind of get to the heart of the matter, right? I would argue that the sort of political crisis or crises that South Africa is facing are fundamentally determined by the structure of the public administration. Right? So I guess first, how I want to characterize this crisis is that basically what we're experiencing is the corruption of the South African state, right? So what's corruption? Let me ask that at the outset. Huh? Yeah. Right. 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 So is the kind of abuse of public office for private regarding reasons, we could say. What are examples of corruption? Like how can you abuse office? Yeah. Right. Okay. So that's like a kind of version of embezzlement, you could say. Right. It's another example. State capture. Huh? Okay. Okay. Right. You said state capture. Right. Right. Yeah. Right. Right. Stealing. Well, what does state capture mean? Right. Right. Someone that shouldn't be influenced by or someone those lines. Um, okay. So we got like kind of bribery, embezzlement, um, this general notion of kind of abuse of public office for private interest. Um, State capture as like a kind of example of that. Maybe like the kind of the way in which state decisions are biased towards particular interests, you could say. Um, so, is corruption a bad thing? Does anyone think it isn't a bad thing? Why not? Not entirely, okay? Right? Okay, so like a little bit of looseness in the rules kind of lubricates procedures and such and makes the administration move more quickly, you could say. Right? Yeah, it gets around bureaucracy, eliminates red tape, you could say. Right? 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 Exactly, yeah. Right, right, right. Any other kind of? It depends. Well, we can certainly say that. Yeah. Um, okay. Do you think? Is anyone think like a kind of anti-corruption as a distraction from more important issues? No. So anti-corruption is the most important thing, or corruption is the most important problem to resolve. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it does have a certain kind of centrality, right? Um, so in South African law, there's a kind of definition of corruption in terms of the Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Practices Act of 2004, um, which basically has two elements, right? So it basically says that corruption is an attempted or actual exchange of a gratification, a benefit of some kind, uh, for the irregular performance of a duty arising out of a legal obligation. Right? Uh, some features of that is that it kind of focuses, it zeroes in on what we might call bribery. Right? Um, it applies both in the public sector and the private sector. Um, it is a fairly kind of narrow definition of corruption, as we've kind of seen. Right? So we've got some other notions floating around. Right? When I speak about corruption, when I speak about I'm speaking about what I see as something a little bit more substantial and fundamental. Right? Um, in the whole vocabulary of politics, it would be difficult to point out a term that's more frequently employed than corruption. And this isn't just in contemporary times in South Africa. This applies across world history. Um, the earliest evidence that we have of corruption discourse appears in the opposition between gift giving and bribery, um, and especially as elaborated through kind of nascent notions of judicial impartiality. You know? And this happens in ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. You know? So, for example, Pharaoh Horemheb, who unified Upper and Lower Egypt, issued a great edict in 1300 BCE for the Common Era, which establishes capital punishment for any judge who commits a crime against injustice in the course of receiving the reward of another. Right? The book of Exodus, written in the course of and after was called the Babylonian captivity of the royal court of the kingdom of Judah in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, lays down as a commandment that thou shalt take no gift, for the gift blindeth the wise and perverteth the words of the righteous. Um, Such injunctions are elaborated in detail in Jewish religious law, Greek and Roman law, Christian and canon law, Islamic law, and the common and civil law traditions. They get rich treatment. Rich treatment is given to corruption across the whole body of human political thought. In Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Politics, in Kautilya's Arthashastra, it's an Indian text, in the Analects of Confucius and the Mencius of Mengzi, in St. Augustine's City of God, in Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah, in Machiavelli's Discourses on Livy and other documents, in Adam Smith's The Theory of Moral Sentiments and The Wealth of Nations. All these and a range of others elaborate or progressively elaborate a quite expansive notion of corruption, which includes stuff like embezzlement, bribery, and the various forms of abuse of office, as well as all forms of perversion of good judgment. Patronage. Does anyone know what patronage is? Right, partly. I mean, we usually think about patronage as a kind of direct exchange of resources, ordinary but not always those of the state, as a way of building political support. Venality, right, so the sale of offices to generate public revenue. This has happened at various points in human history, but also for purposes of private enrichment. People have used the notion of corruption to refer to materialistic decadence, right? To the decline of martial virtues and manly virtues of war and such. To commerce. Commerce has often been seen as fundamentally corrupting. Profiteering, so the pursuit of kind of unfair or illegal profits. All forms of the elevation of sectional or private interest over the common interest. Factionalism has often been referred to as corruption, as well as political violence, and in that direction, elaborating to a notion of general political and social disorder, degeneration, and decay. So when I speak about corruption, or the corruption of the South African state, what I'm gesturing towards is that the state is coming undone. All these different kind of examples of what people have referred to as corruption are in human history remarkably commonly interconnected. Right? Forms a coherent and mutually interacting whole. Central to modern structures is what we call patronage machines. Does everyone know what a patronage machine is? So a patronage machine, so we know what patronage is, right? It's the exchange of a resource for political support. A patronage machine is is what Weber would call a bureaucracy, right, for delivering these sorts of resources. Usually or always actually. What it looks like is it's got a leadership, which might be what we call a boss or a council of some sort, which then distributes to the classic models of within a city. Let's say New York, for example, you'd have a city boss, which then distributes to precincts or sorry to boroughs. Right? So you've got the 5 boroughs of New York, then distributes to precincts, to wards, and ultimately to city blocks. Right? And therefore, or from that point rather, um, to voters. Right? So in a place like New York, which is in fact the first place in the world that developed a facial machine, um, from Ireland you climb off a boat and someone would say, you need some help, join Tammany Hall, right? Or like you go to approach these guys in the city block and you say, I'm having this trouble, like I'm just gonna fight for my job, I'm struggling to sustain myself and such, and then this guy say, yeah, we can help you. We've got a job going on here, we'll give you that. But remember, we help you this time, next election, help Tammany Hall. It's roughly the way it works. Um, so central to kind of modern system of corruption is this notion of a patronage machine, because a patronage machine is what sustains support for practices that might otherwise be seen as legitimate. Um, Lots of people benefit from corruption. Um, more broadly, the concept of corruption, its vital purpose and the kind of work that it's doing in politics is that it's regulating social conduct by delimiting, denouncing, and dismantling these sorts of practices and processes. And it does so precisely in order to maintain and prevent the collapse of state institutions. Um, it has played this role for at least 4,000 years. Arguably, corruption discourse is original and by all indications inherent to human statecraft as such. Um, so, the practices and processes that corruption refers to, so embezzlement, bribery, venality, patronage, materialistic decadence, illicit profiteering, the elevation of sectional or private interests over common interests, factionalism, political violence, political disorder, degeneration, decay. These are all present in South Africa in some shape. And so my concern is partly to explain why. Why is that the case? Um, and in doing so, South Africa is not unique. Right? Um, I've discussed that this notion of corruption is 4,000 years old at least. Um, most countries of the world have at some point, most countries in the modern world have at some point gone through an episode of debilitating corruption. Um, some countries have gotten out of it. Most countries in that set still have severe levels of corruption that do stuff like threaten democracy and the rise of tyranny, produce weak economic performance, generate inequality, and so on. Um, so my question isn't only to explain why South Africa is experiencing this thing, but also to suggest ways of resolving the problem. So in South Africa now, what's the most prominent approach to kind of anti-corruption? Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, what in the public debate, what do people think is how we resolve this thing? Yeah? That's one way, but what are the commissions for? Punish. Right? So how do we punish? We prosecute. You know? That's yeah. Right. Right. So, this is the kind of argument that electoral accountability is necessary to resolve corruption. So, parties ought to be punished at the polls, right? And that's how you resolve corruption. Right? Yeah, so this notion of accountability is essential, um, and the notion that you search out and you discover corruption, and then you prosecute, you put people in prison, you vote people out of power, you proceed in that fashion. Right? This is the classic approach to anti-corruption. Right? It's been practiced forever. The last 4,000 years, people have been prosecuting people for corruption. Much of Greek politics, for example, ancient or classical Greece, revolved around denunciations of people for corruption and prosecution on the Areopagus, which is like a rock outside the city of Athens, and sometimes people would be prosecuted, sometimes people would be punished, and sometimes they wouldn't. Um, but you can start to see what's creeping in here, like these denunciations and counter-denunciations of corruption, which have also become a very popular feature of South African politics. One thing is that it is the classical approach, and also I can say with certainty that prosecution, accountability, these sorts of things have always been a feature of all successful anti-corruption movements. Um, None has worked without that. But at the same time, on comparative experience, anti-corruption movements that focus exclusively on prosecution, accountability, and so on fail to produce, or always fail, if they focus exclusively on that, but also often produce adverse consequences unintended. Um, there's lots of countries, for example, that have comparative party systems where there's changeover in power every 4 or 5 years, but that are still deeply corrupt. Um, Brazil is one example. Much of Latin America, in fact, and various other parts of the world, India, etc. Um, and the reason is really that prosecution of corruption is inherently difficult, costly, and time-consuming. Corrupt people adapt. Right? They get better at not getting caught. People tend to demand popular justice, right? So people get tired of due process in the ways in which it often doesn't lead to outcomes. It takes time. Um, so popular support tends to either drop off or to manifest in authoritarian ways, right? Ways that say that we ought not to go through due process. Prosecution maximizes costs for politicians. So as popular support drops off, they resist prosecution by politicizing prosecutorial and judicial functions, um, by eroding their capacities through a range of legislative handicaps or defunding. Prosecution under conditions of systemic corruption, where corruption is very widespread, is inherently selective, and it is difficult to develop criteria that specify in relation to a manageable caseload, and that can be easily adjudicated by the public. So what this means is that corruption is often perceived to be political, as a weapon against political enemies, and it often becomes that. Right? And especially in these circumstances where popular forces turn against due process, this circumstance can play into the emergence of various forms of regressive leader. Um, Contemporary examples of people that have risen in this sort of way are Vladimir Putin, Narendra Modi, Rodrigo Duterte, to some extent Donald Trump, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. Pick a far-right leader in the contemporary world, and 9 times out of 10 they rose with an anti-corruption campaign, and one concerned with prosecution. Yeah. All of these dynamics that I mentioned, except for the highly regressive leader, are present in nascent form in South African anti-corruption politics. We can see that the prosecution service is going slowly. People are getting despondent. I think Ramaphosa isn't moving fast enough. Right? They say that Ramaphosa must act, right? But Ramaphosa doesn't have the power to act, not legally speaking. He sets up an independent prosecutor. The prosecutor must act, right? But the prosecutor doesn't have the resources, etc. You kind of see where this goes. Right? looks like we're heading towards kind of missed opportunities and potential disaster. Huh? Yeah.
Um, in a situation like we currently have in South Africa, would you not? What do you think of Ramaphosa acting unconstitutionally, probably, to um, bring forward a decisive outcome in um, punishing individuals who are guilty of corruption, just to almost um, show a sense of urgency and act swiftly and act on what the public wants. Because, as you said, um, trying to pinpoint and eventually prosecute corruption is such a difficult and lengthy process. And if, after all these current commissions that we have, I think the South African electorate and the public might really lose their morale and faith in government, and will we might even start to see lower voting numbers and so forth.
Right.
Yeah.
So what do you think?
I think it maybe goes back to what we said when you asked what corruption is,
Yeah.
and so we heard people say uh, it's dependent on situations, and I suppose maybe in a situation like this, if Ramaphosa had to um, illegally wield power for the greater good, the public might show favor, but of course, then that creates a whole lot of issues because then the legislative branch would have to act fairly predictably, and then that might create a very difficult situation.
Right. So right. So like the is your hand up? Okay. Yeah. 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 Yeah, go for it. Yeah. I mean, do we want a president that prosecutes people outside of due process, etc., etc.? Is that not a dangerous situation? Right. Um,
No, I was just not that I wanted it. I was just putting forward the idea, and may or could it maybe in a situation like this, we maybe I don't know, create room. And I'm just I'm thinking aloud. Create room for a president. I understand maybe it might work in a state of emergency, but in when it's not a state of emergency where the country is under threat, uh, possibly give allowance for a president to, I don't know, let's say, almost like how a president, I don't know if they can do it in South Africa, but provide pardon
yeah,
to,
okay.
yeah, he can provide pardon to criminals. Can he not also, um, not all the time, but have some political capital and legal capital to act outside of due process to deliver some on something that maybe the public needs immediately?
So I guess to kind of like unravel this, right? Um, what I'd probably be in favour of is some measure of coordination between the public prosecutor and Ramaphosa regarding who to prosecute at which times, right? Regarding what the political consequences of which prosecutions. Right? So what we don't want is the Ramaphosa faction, which has pretty profound patronage elements, in fact, um, to collapse under the weight of prosecutions. So people go after name your Ramaphosa faction person who's corrupt. There's at least one in the top six. Um, um, maybe they shouldn't be prosecuted. So, for example, this ANC Integrity Commission, um, I think it overreached, right, with that list of 22 people. It makes very little sense to, at this point, go after Greta Montash. You know? So, there may be justifications for that, and what it does allow for is some measure of check and balance between the National Prosecuting Authority and Ramaphosa, because he's not deciding who to have this discussion. potential slippery slope, but these are complicated times. Um, but we can't prosecute everyone, because the whole political order and the public administration would collapse. Every single party has major corruption allegations against some of its members. Its leadership have to some extent, not every party, because some of them haven't come close enough to power, but the top six, the top six parties have had some allegations of corruption. Plausible ones that the leadership have avoided dealing with. Um, so if we decide to kind of remove all our parties, we'd end up with an entirely new party system. And what's happened, for example, in Italy, after their major corruption scandals and investigations of the 1920s called Clean Hands, um, what happened was the old party system of Christian Democrats and Socialists fell apart. And this provided room ultimately for the rise of Silvio Berlusconi, who was a kind of trial run of Trumpism, and now what could almost accurately be described as neo-fascism. So we don't know what we're going to get. There's lots of problematic elements that would be vying for power. So these are the sorts of maladies that focus on prosecution might produce, and that often does produce. Most anti-corruption drives, in fact, create worse consequences than they started with. This is partly because the kind of naive view is that you focus on prosecution, you punish, that's how you deal with corruption. It's actually not how you deal with corruption. It's partly how you deal with corruption. It's you need other elements, which I'm going to get into. I guess the first thing to note is that, and this is quite a general point, when dealing with kind of policy problems on this scale, one's approach ought to be evidence-based. And the only evidence that one has with policy problems on this scale, the only evidence one has is comparative. So comparisons between countries and in countries over time. That's what you call the comparative historical approach. And that's how I'm approaching things. The comparative evidence suggests the importance of corruption, but the centrality of a process of reform of the institutions of the state in ways that restrict the flow of patronage, which is the means of gaining support for corrupt projects and so on. So the concern is the state too open to patronage distributions? After all, the history of corruption discourse of anti-corruption isn't simply, as I suggested earlier, the history of efforts at maintaining state institutions. It's also always been a part of the process of building them in opposition to pre-existing practices. Patronage arguably is the kind of natural form of politics. In every country, there's some patronage. So, even if you take, say, let me think of an example. So, say the New Zealand cabinet. So New Zealand is a famously not corrupt country. The cabinet is filled by patronage. There's no civil service procedures that restrict who you appoint and such. You appoint on the basis of who you can bring in to build a political coalition that allows you to take state power. It's impossible to imagine a political system that doesn't have some patronage. But the issue is the extent and how it's shaped and so on. So let's go to another kind of definitional thing. What's the state? So there's kind of two terms here, right? So we've talked about corruption as a process of the kind of general decay, disintegration, the collapse of the state. But what is the state? So one way in which the state can be conceptually built up is as follows. Human beings, like us, spend most of their time in institutions, which we can define as ensembles of rules and relations between, or roles and relations between roles. These roles and relations governed by rules, norms, scripts, routines. A feature of institutions that's specified is that they are sustained by and they embed within themselves resources and power. Institutions, in turn, are the building blocks of organizations, and organizations are ensembles of institutions that are linked to authoritative decision-making roles, which are more or less, and organizations are more or less consciously constructed to mobilize power or to mobilize resources and power in the pursuit of goals. So, the state is an organization. It's distinguished from other organizations in the sense that, um, or by the fact that it claims more or less successfully, and therefore to some extent is recognized by the states to have, especially by the states to have, final priority of decision. Basically, the state is the organization within a particular territory that claims for itself authority, the ability to make decisions for everyone there. That power is always constrained, it's always limited to some extent. But that's what the state is. And what I mean when I refer to process of state formation is simply the process through which states, thus conceived, are constructed, how they change over time. Corruption can be understood as the process through which states, thus conceived, come undone, as I've mentioned before. Importantly, state decisions are typically executed by a specific type of organization, which is called the bureaucracy. And I want to argue where I'm going here, and we're going to range quite widely. What I'm going to argue is that the historical relationship between bureaucracy and democracy, or more broadly, the emergence of mass politics, so the involvement of ever wider circles of people in the political process, explains the pattern of corruption across the globe. Bureaucracies can be distinguished from other forms of organization by the following characteristics. They have a division of labor, with offices defined by some sense of jurisdiction and by the allocation of powers and duties. Officers are organized into a hierarchy, a system of super and subordination, with higher levels issuing commands, setting rules, and allocating powers and duties to lower levels. Officers are filled by persons with training and expertise in the duties of the office. Training and expertise being proven by examinations or certificates. Rules in bureaucracy are set, or they operate abstractly, which is to say, without regard for persons, or to put that another way, impersonally and impartially. In work processes, in bureaucracies, powers and duties, because there's a division of labor and so on, are segregated between officers in such a way that in a work process, one person universally takes the work from another person, and to some extent balances it. So if the work isn't done properly, it may go back and may be reported. In a bureaucracy, information is kept in files to support evidence-based decision making, and decisions are recorded for purposes of accountability and precedent. There is in bureaucracy a regular and continuous execution of assigned tasks, which means that the official activity demands the full working capacity of the official, so there are restrictions on outside employment. If the notion of corruption emerges in the opposition between gift-giving and bribery, the notion of bureaucracy emerges in the opposition between the household of the ruler and the modern state. Like anti-corruption, bureaucracy develops from ancient times. Right? So, in Mesopotamia, in the Sumerian government, 5,500 years ago, it's just a random thing, the stuff before then, there was, in the Sumerian government, an administration with a very rough division of labor, with vague allocations of powers and duties, with relations of super and subordination. Offices were sometimes filled by people with expertise, such as scribes. Some rules were generally applicable and written down in something that approximates law. In Samaria, 5,500 years ago, archives were kept with information and records of decision. stone tablets, so on and so forth. Um, However, kind of administration in 5,500 years ago in Mesopotamia um, occurs ultimately as an extension of the ruler's household. You know? So it's very extensively personalized. All these bureaucratic features like the rules and so on are cross-cut by personal relations, and they're often vague and defeasible. They're not very genuinely applicable. From this point, this is the same things happening in Egypt, the same things happening in China, and so on. Wherever states formed and took on administrative responsibilities at scale, bureaucracies formed. By the second millennium of the Common Era, which is 1,000 or so years ago by now, large-scale bureaucracies could be found in all continents across the globe except for Antarctica, of course. So the Incas had a bureaucracy, the Aztecs, the Haza Fulani, Sokoto Caliphate, the Kingdom of the Congo, China, India, parts of Indonesia, Malaysia, and so on. Into this millennium, so we're kind of going into the second millennium. And over the preceding kind of 7,000 years, states very gradually became involved in more technically complex operations across more numerous functions, coordinated over larger distances within shorter time frames, with a greater demand for precision and regularity in operation. All these developments required, and they produced sharpening of bureaucratic features. So the division of labor became more precisely defined. The powers and duties of officers became more precise. The hierarchy became more pure, you could say. It kind of began resolving into a single line of command. Especially, the sort of refining of the bureaucratic model happened during processes of interstate warfare. This was, for many years, only kind of overcome to some extent the last, say, 50 or 60 years. Um, warfare was the most profound driver of bureaucratization. Um, and the first kind of, or rather, let's say the first major sharpening of the bureaucratic model happened in China in what is called the Spring and Autumn and the Warring States periods. So that's extending between 722 BCE and 221 BCE, which saw prolonged conflict that reduced over 100 states, separate states, into one under what was called the Qin dynasty. This was the unification of China. And that process, intensive warfare, so we're talking about a little bit over 500 years of continuous warfare. There was no period except for a few years where people weren't fighting each other. You know? This resulted in what is a remarkably elaborate doctrine of bureaucratic regimentation, known as fagia, right, or in Anglophone style legalism, which stressed the clarification of hierarchy and officers, impersonality in the application of rules, strict discipline and punishment, and importantly, merit in processes of appointment. In 605, in the Common Era, Emperor Yang of Sui, with some precedent, so this was happening a little bit before then, established the first system of imperially administered exams as a requirement for entry into state office. This examination was made competitive, so whoever got the better scores got in 997 in the Common Era. By 1400, around 1 in 2,200 people in China were preparing to write the initial exam. 1 in 2,200. Right? So it's 600 years ago, a little more than that. By 700, 1 in 300 people were preparing to write the exam. Right? By this point, China has a literacy rate of around 40%. It's around 400 years ago. The Chinese imperial examination system, I mean, this is roughly, this long history is roughly the basis of China's is in part the basis of China's modern economic success. It's also the basis of China's authoritarianism. The Chinese imperial examination system was first translated into Latin by Jesuit priests in the late 1600s. It became, in Europe, a cornerstone of bureaucratic reforms, which were pursued in the course of its own millennium of war making. So, between 1066, which was the Norman invasion of Britain, of England, rather, Europe is also brought into a process of sustained warfare. Also, only a few years Europe isn't at war with itself. Um, States in Europe are built in preparation for war. So Charles Tilly says that war made the state and the state made war. The Chinese system of imperial examinations became the model for European bureaucratization. Austria in 1754 was the first to examine examinations in its diplomatic service. Prussia, then known as the Sparta of the North and subsequently the Unifier of Germany, established examinations more broadly, followed by Scandinavian countries. These established a tradition of competitive examinations, which for the first time oriented around legal studies. From this example, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan adopted examinations. They had to some extent Chinese examinations before, but the Chinese in the early encounter with Europe felt that examinations were an anachronistic practice. The Europeans weren't doing it, so they abandoned it, even at the same time that the Europeans were adopting it. So did Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, and ultimately these countries adopted, broadly modeled on the German system. All these countries, those of kind of Central and Northern Europe, as well as those of Far East Asia, these countries democratized late, and when they did, they had a stratum of professional administrators formed, which were formed, or they had formed a stratum of professional administrators that restricted political access to supply of patronage. They're professionals. They operate according to rules. If a politician comes down and says, I want to meddle in an administrative process to direct resources to my friends and my political supporters, they'd say no. Politicians don't do anything about it because the bureaucrats were powerful. A whole range of interests around them that favoured efficient, regular, predictable administration. These countries that democratized after the establishment of what's called an autonomous bureaucracy largely avoided an episode of what we might call mass-based patronage machine politics. It never really happened in Germany, Scandinavia, Japan, in South Korea, and Taiwan. These countries today also exhibit, although East Asian example is a little bit different, very low incidence of corruption. It's almost unheard of in Scandinavia because people get removed for getting a gift of a bottle of wine and such. The core of the British state, which was of course very relevant to South Africa, the core of the state, which is the treasury and the military apparatus, what is today called the fiscal military state, had professionalized considerably under the efforts of under the impetus of warfare expenditure during war, and also the British Parliament concerned about not being taxed too much. The fiscal military state in Britain professionalized considerably by the late 1600s, but a lack of restrictions on appointments elsewhere meant the country's first Prime Minister, Robert Walpole, from 1721 established the world's first system of parliamentary patronage. This is what became known as the Old Corruption. People like Edmund Burke and Jeremy Bentham cut their teeth on fighting the system of old corruption, on electoral, economic, and administrative reform. Edmund Burke, in particular, famously in the campaign against corruption in the British East India Company, was the kind of foreign arm of the British state, and it was also an expression of the extent to which corruption or anti-corruption is racialized in in the European tradition. Because the real concern is that India is corrupting British political and administrative institutions. In Britain, partly through the efforts of these sorts of people, a commission is set up in the 1840s called the Northcote Trevelyan Commission. Northcote's a famous bureaucrat in the fiscal military estate, and Trevelyan is a parliamentarian. They set up a commission, and this commission adopts the Chinese system, which, in the process of them arguing for this, was regularly denounced in the press as Chinese barbarism. But it became the basis of the British civil service system, implemented progressively up until 1870, um, just before the advent of manhood suffrage in Britain. Britain itself, while the system of old corruption, because everyone or all men only got the vote in 1870, so before then it was a very small size of people that could vote. And so the patronage in the parliament operated to a very limited extent. There weren't that many people that were worth buying. And so Britain itself, because it insulated the bureaucracy before it extended the suffrage to the working class and the poor, largely avoided a mass-based patronage machine. It never really happened in Britain. When Labour emerges, it emerges as a programmatic party. The United States, the world's first mass democracy, with effective white manhood suffrage by the 1820s, establishes the first mass-based patronage machine. So I mentioned earlier that literally the first place this happened was New York City. In 1800, a person named Aaron Burr was also the person that killed another person named Alexander Hamilton, who was the builder of the American state. Aaron Burr shot him in a duel. They insulted each other. So this was the first shot fired in the battle between the state builders and the patronage politicians in American politics. This conflict would define the American political system for the next century. The American mass-based patronage regime became known as the spoils system, on the kind of motto that to the victor goes the spoils. Andrew Jackson was the first to extend it on a national scale. He was elected in 1828. Argued that a bureaucracy is undemocratic. In fact, every citizen should have an opportunity to take public office for a period of time. It should be kept to only one set of individuals. Why should it not be kept to one set of individuals? Because it's a kind of public that everyone should benefit, but also the duties of office for a person like Andrew Jackson are so simple that anyone can do them. That's the view. It's the same view adopted by another politician named Vladimir Lenin, who argued precisely the same thing. But within 4 years, he was arguing that the workers' and peasants' inspection, which was the way in which the party controlled the state, ought to be constituted by competitive exam, because he found that they were doing a poor job in controlling the administration, and the administration was becoming overpowerful. That argument's always been a bad argument. So wherever people have tried to create a modern administration of amateurs, severe problems have followed. So, the United States was the first place to establish a mass-based patronage machine. And wherever this happened, the United States was the first place that it did. And it happened subsequently across much of the globe. In southern, or in Latin Europe and Eastern Europe, they went through quite a different process. It was really one of when say France went to war with England for around 400 years there, um, it did so on the basis of a very different system of parliament. Right? In Britain, in 1600, there was a civil war. Right? So when the Roman Empire was coming undone, um, the Roman Empire started introducing what are known as Saxon federati into the kind of the Roman domain. These people would protect the borders and do all these sorts of things, and they were barbarians, and they fought against the kind of Romano-British elite. And in the course of the Civil War, the Roman state in Britain collapsed, disappeared. Um, but never in France and in Spain and in Italy. In these places, the state still remained. And what that meant was that local government was not autonomous. Right? It was all centralized. It lacked distributed power. Britain had to constitute kind of communes. People in the communes had a fair amount of say regarding how the local governments are administered. France not so much. Right? So what happened in Britain was that representation in Parliament was territorial. So it was constituencies, same system that they have now. Right? People from particular areas elect their representative, and the representative goes. That representative is the leader of the area, and because they control their administration, so they have access to lots of resources. They can resist the king. In France, they couldn't really, so they had to find a different basis of representation. What they found was the three estates, which was the nobility, the clergy, and the commoners. And those estates would, over time, basically paid off against each other. So divide and rule tactics meant that the people, or people that paid taxes, couldn't resist central advances. Right? So the French state taxed heavily and inefficiently. And it got to the point where we had to sell offices. So sold offices and made them hereditary. So people could, the person that collects taxes for the tax fund, buy the office, often employ someone else to do the work. That office would then be passed down to his son and so on. That meant is that it became very difficult to reform the French state. This is part of the French Revolution. And even since then, the French state was kind of defined by patronage relations. Napoleon did some work to that effect, but not entirely. And so when you go into the kind of first French Republic, it becomes mass-based patronage, much like in the United States. Similar processes in Spain and the rest of Latin Europe. That model, earlier versions of venality and syndicalism and that kind of stuff, is exported to Latin America, then follows roughly the same principle. These countries democratize before they manage to democratize in the same sense that Germany and other countries do. Until this day, they generally have more corruption, more patience, all that kind of thing. Similar processes in much of the rest of the world. So the process was pioneered by the United States, the first mass democracy. Like audible. No, I think lots of water. Sure. So, wherever this happened, and it happened subsequently in much of the world, so in Latin and East Europe it happened, in Latin America we've kind of covered, in the Middle East and Africa and Central and Southeast Asia, much of the world has had mass-based patronage policies. Right? So that's the way the systems work. The linkage between the state and the people has been one of direct distributions to political supporters rather than general rule-based impartial distributions. So the model is one of giving jobs, contracts, housing, all these sorts of things directly to people rather than giving stuff like generalized local grants, etc. More often some combination of the two. Um, wherever that's happened, it's produced kind of governmental problems. Um, wherever it's happened, it's produced kind of anti-corruption movements which are concerned with establishing more effective states. Um, and it's become especially problematic, these sorts of patronage systems, because of industrialization and all the sorts of things that involves. You know? So I kind of mentioned before that for most of human history, it's kind of war making that provided the major step changes in bureaucratization. From the Industrial Revolution, there's a much more profound and powerful dynamic, which is that industrialization creates a whole range of demands for the administration of things. Uh, Populations expand considerably. Their concentration in places like cities. Just to give one example, a city is a massively complicated place to administer. Um, Cities require, as a matter of course, the collection of water, the reticulation, the distribution of water on a large scale. Um, so in a place like Johannesburg, something like 2 million people get roughly water every day. To manage that system is complicated. Um, Sanitation is complicated, and it's necessary to avoid epidemics of cholera or other sorts of diseases. Um, Essentially, start building public roads, systems of mass transportation, to regulate buildings, how they're constructed and so on, to regulate the way the city is spatial, um, to regulate the environment, to make sure that there's that the air is not very dirty, etc., etc. Um, to regulate what kind of shops are set up. Local government takes on all these sorts of functions, and all of them to some extent require extremely complex administration. They require people with considerable expertise. And so, in situations where people are appointed on the basis of their political support, all of these places have run into severe administrative problems. Reformers in the United States, in response to associated pressures, those sorts of pressures, adopted the British model. So from around 1850, there's the emergence of what's called the American Civil Service Reform League, which does study tours of Britain and try to figure out what's going on, what works, and they decide that they want a comparative examination. And in 1871, roughly the second shot in state building, in the fight between state building and patronage, between the reform movement and patronage element, was fired when a disappointed spoil seeker, a person that was promised an office, assassinates President Garfield. He's killed by a spoil seeker. And in response, there's a kind of moral panic, and the decision is that there needs to be the creation of a civil service examination, an independent administration, and so on. And what's passed is what's called the Pendleton Act. And passed it. And the Pendleton Act has a very specific and interesting mechanism, which is that it doesn't say that all at once we're going to have an independent administration covered in competitive exams, and, competitive exams administered by what's called the Civil Service Commission, and so on. What it says is this: it says partly what it says implicitly is the patronage system is too powerful to do this all at once. There's too many interests arrayed against this thing. But what we're going to give is the president the power by executive order to cover parts of the administration in to the Civil Service Commission administered system. And so presidents do that bit by bit. Right? So they pass executive orders, they say, grade 3 postal workers are covered in, and all those postal workers will now be appointed by the Civil Service Commission rather than by the Postal Service. What that means is that whenever presidents are about to lose power to their political opponents, whenever the Republican Party is about to lose power to the Democratic Party, presidents cover part of that administration in. They do that to protect their own patronage appointment, to deny patronage to their political opponents. And that, as well as a fair amount of pressure from the Civil Service Reform League, defines the expansion of the American civil service system. It happened, or it's extended, the small system was effectively broken by 1905. The guy that did it is Theodore Roosevelt. Which is popular. I imagine why Cyril Ramaphosa was always citing these Roosevelts. Theodore Roosevelt was, before he became president, appointed as one of the civil service commissioners. He was a member of the Civil Service Reform League. He worked in these circles, and he extended the system. And although it was kind of eroded at various points in history, it's kind of, to a significant extent, maintained an American administration which is significantly corruption-free. So there are issues in the American system to the extent that the top 3 or 4 layers, at least, when the president comes in, he appoints around 3,000 people. And so, sometimes there are kind of functions that are taken up into this political system and deals with drug and such. But the main form of corruption, which we would hear about in the United States, is not actually, legally speaking, corruption. It is people paying for people's political campaigns and then getting favorable regulatory decisions, getting, in particular, good laws. So that's what people call corruption. But what people like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and these people who are now denouncing the system and corruption are doing is that they are defining space that for many years wasn't considered to be corrupt. Another range of countries also followed roughly this experience, but it happened more quickly. The United States, being the first country that democratized, was especially its administration. The administration that occurred after the American Revolutionary War was a coterie of around 2,000 notables who got together and did stuff. And they'd kind of appoint other notables as a measure of corruption involved. But the federal administration in particular was so small, they're pretty much inconsequential. So when it expanded, the democracy penetrated it quite effectively. Another range of countries, also went through the American process, but did so a lot more quickly and a lot more thoroughly. And those countries are the British settler colonies. New Zealand, in particular, by 1900 has a competitive examination system. 1 or 2 decades after it gets self-government, the administration that it inherited from colonial government was quite substantial, because the British, after the American Revolutionary War, were very concerned that they would lose other colonies to uprisings. The American colonial administration, or the English colonial administration in America, was also a very light touch. It didn't really get involved in much. When it started to try to get involved, then the Revolutionary War happened. It started to kind of expand taxes and such. The British learned from that experience, and in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, established more substantial bureaucracies. It held these countries under colonial government, Canada until the 1850s, Australia until the 1870s, New Zealand until the 1890s. And what this meant was that Britain kind of transplanted its institutions into these spaces. And so, when democracies emerged in these places, the result was a class of professional administrators that prevented jobbery and that kind of stuff in the administration to a significant extent. It wasn't quite Germany, but it was almost there. And this made the process of reform quite easy. Right? So, whereas in the United States, what effectively reformed the administration was a mass movement of civil service reformers. Every major city would have a branch. That branch would be reforming the city, also be reforming more broadly. In Australia and Canada, or Australia and New Zealand, the process was a lot easier. It was effectively reformed by small groups of elite public servants and politicians. Um, Canada was a little bit more complicated, partly because Canada had left the the British imperial system early, but also Canada had another aspect, which was called the Quebecois, which is the French Canadians. And the French Canadians generally marginalized within the Canadian political system um, in those years, marginalized in terms of kind of economic opportunities, educational opportunities, these sorts of factors. Um, they were resistant to the creation of a system of competitive examinations. Right? Because the system of competitive examinations favors people with high educational attainment, with resources to put into this country. They preferred political appointments. And so the Canadian system, even to this day, has fairly profound patronage elements, partly on the basis of this conflict, especially in what's called the Ottawa Service, the federal government. But it did say significant reform. So there's another British settler colony. South Africa follows, to a large extent, the same process, right? So South Africa is partly an early kind of mover in terms of the establishment of examination. Because like India, it's a place where the British state can innovate without having to deal with the constraints of a democracy. And so it establishes comparative exams even before Britain does, in the Cape Colony in 1852. But that system doesn't work, right? Because South Africa is an incredibly poor country at the time. It's struggling just to get people that have passed the matric or equivalent. The exam is set at like a grade 8 level in comparison to the British experience. And so, by Cape Colony gets self-government, and by 1870, there's a commission called the Hull Commission, which basically says that the system of exams has fallen into disrepair, and all the officers have fallen into the patronage of political leaders. Cape Colony had a patronage system amongst voters. Rhodes' first cabinet was dismantled. His first government fell apart on the basis of a kind of corruption scandal. What had happened was that the Cape Government Railways, which were by far the biggest employer of people in the Cape Colony at the time, entered into a contract with a friend of Rhodes named, I don't know his first name, but his surname is Sibright. And the contract basically means that Sibright takes control over all the appointments or all the business involved in catering all the railways of the Cape Government. There's major patronage. This is thousands of jobs and suddenly fall into the patronage of Sibright. And the more kind of liberal reforming elements of the Cape administration, John X. Merriman and these sorts of people, they denounce this and they break apart the cabinet. So Rhodes' first government fell on the basis of corruption. This is a feature of Cape Colony politics at the time. Famously, kind of ineffective state, can't really get things done. People go into the railways at the time, and they, there's a kind of the government appoints a private investigator to figure out what's going on here. Right? And this guy basically travels the railways for free. People are just saying, "Yeah, get on for free, then you have a ticket." What else is happening? So like he goes to the stores and people are basically selling stores, right? So railway equipment, food, etc., etc. There's a railway doctor that offers pharmaceuticals to them, and so on and so forth. The railways are basically denounced as a system that's, the railways, the trains are never on time, they crash very often, they're kind of falling apart, etc., etc. I think it was fairly fundamentally politicized, lacking in skills and so on. Cape Colony, um, partly for this reason, but also partly because the way in which railways are very important to Cape politics. Potentially the thing that politicians pay the most attention to. Is partly they want railways in their own districts, because just if you've got a railway, then you can bring stuff to market in Cape Town, you can do a whole heap of things. So you're also going to be able to distribute some jobs. People in the area are going to get contracts to do a whole heap of things for the railway. So this is a big load of patronage that's coming to your area. So basically, the Cape Parliament decides on who gets railways, um, and it can only pass a railway bill if 50% plus one constituencies agree to that. And why 50% plus one constituencies can agree to that? Because they're going to get a railway. And so, what the Cape Colony experiences is runaway railway building. It builds far more railways than it can possibly afford. And it is effectively by the early 1900s bankrupt. For a short period, the railways ran at a profit. For 2 years in which the only railway that went to the Rand, Johannesburg and so on, was a Cape Railway. So they beat all the other railways from Natal and so on, from Maputo to the Rand. For 2 years they were profitable. Then Durban got there, then Maputo got there, and they came bankrupt. And so, this partly fed into the Anglo-Boer War, but it also meant that in the early 1900s, the Cape Colony was quite concerned about its administration, and again, they established competitive examinations in 1908, just before the unification of South Africa. The unification of South Africa itself is partly premised on the fact that the Cape Colony is bankrupt. And the concerns are that there may be another warlike situation if the Cape Colony doesn't get its share of Rand traffic. A lot of the politics between the colonies hinged on the percentage distribution of that traffic. So the first South African administration is in fact the South African Railways. It was established before the unification of South Africa. But in any case, so the Cape Colony starts a competitive examination system, and thereafter there's the unification of South Africa. And the unification of South Africa occurs in terms of what's called the South Africa Act, 1909, which is an act of the British Parliament. This is after the Anglo-Boer War. The Transvaal Republic and the Orange Free State have been colonized. Now the Orange River Colony and the Transvaal Colony. And because of the railway unification, and it happened. And in the South Africa Act, there's a provision which basically provides for appointments to the administration through what is today known and what was known then as the Public Service Commission. Public Service Commission modelled on the British Civil Service Commission, the American Civil Service Commission, also modelled on the British Civil Service Commission. The basic idea is that the Public Service Commission is going to be an independent body that appoints and promotes stuff in the administration, thereby restricting governmental patronage. But in South Africa, it doesn't ever really do that. The reason is that Afrikaner nationalists of the kind of moderate variety, which I mean people like Louis Botha, the first president of South Africa, and Jan Smuts, they're approaching a state that not only is populated and governed and was set up by people that fought a brutal war against them and put them in concentration camps and so on. A state that was built, they used to call it the Milnerite state. It was built by a guy named Alfred Milner, who in the Transvaal colony said, and the British concern is really gold. He said, I'm going to build a state, paraphrasing, that is so effective and so powerful that no one will ever easily dismantle it. He established the state as a basis of British power in a system where Afrikaners were the majority. And so, obviously, the Afrikaners didn't really appreciate this. Afrikaners were also generally marginalized from political and economic opportunities, and less well educated, etc., etc. They have great concerns regarding the Public Service Commission and so on. And so, in 1908, the Transvaal colony has its first elections. The people that win are a party called Het Volk, which was the leader is Louis Botha, his deputy is Jan Smuts. They immediately politicized the administration, especially the police service. They appoint their own political connections to it. In terms of the South Africa Act of 1909, the Public Service Commission ought to be established. It takes 2 years for them to establish. Partly because what's happening is much like what happened in post-apartheid South Africa is there's a need to amalgamate a whole range of pre-existing administrations. And what amalgamation does is it makes open the higher reaches of the administration. You need to decide who's going to be appointed to these positions. They don't want the Public Service Commission to be something, so they delay the establishment of the Public Service Commission, and they politicise at the higher reaches of the South African public service. The Director Generals and so on are appointed on a political basis by Louis Botha and Jan Smuts. So these are the first 2 episodes of politicisation of the South African public administration. In 1902, the Public Service Commission is established, but from their first annual report, they complain that they're not being allowed to operate in the way that they're set up to operate. In fact, what's happening is that appointments at the higher reaches are being made by politicians, at lower levels are being made by the administrative leadership. The Public Service Commission, although the Constitution says that it's supposed to govern appointments and so on, is effectively being ignored for the first 10 years. Thereafter, there's a brief period in which the Public Service Commission is funded and stuff. That's when Jan Smuts joins with the British Unionists to fend off the more radical Afrikaner nationalist tendency. And that happened for 2 years. And partly on the basis of the fact that Jan Smuts had brought in artillery and aircraft and such to suppress the Rand Rebellion, the rebellion of white workers. Jan Smuts loses the election of 1924 to the National Party, headed by Barry Hertzog. And Barry Hertzog proceeds to politicize a more radical variant of Afrikaner nationalism. Less concerned with people like Louis Botha and Jan Smuts were more concerned with kind of creating a broader sense of South African nationalism. For the National Party, this isn't a concern. In fact, this is seen as a kind of accommodationist position of British imperialism. So they politicised. Same happened with Milan in 1948. The Public Service Commission takes on more and more power, but the Public Service Commission is appointed by political leaders, and it's heavily politicised. So people that get positions are people that are in the Afrikaner nationalist establishment. The sort of insulation that's associated with civil service commissions and exams and all that kind of stuff in South Africa, because of this political dynamic, which we might describe as national pressure. South Africa never really gets there. So, although it's travelling alongside the other settler colonies, from the early 19th century, at least by 1930, it's become clear that it's varying in one particular important aspect of society. There's heavy politicisation. And of course, we all know the kind of issue of 1994. People are dealing with a state that's controlled by apartheid operatives who are involved in establishing special benefits for white people, often in violent repression of black people and so on. This is not a state that the African National Congress feels that they can work with and can trust for good reason. There's concerns with the fact that systems of kind of vague or rather of unrefined merit will favour white people over black people. All these sorts of things feed into a politicisation of the administration of 1994 again. And so, after 1994, the Public Service Commission is actually, although it's reconstituted on a non-racial basis, there's one commissioner there as of the transfer. He's been there for some time, and he's controlling people discover all the decision making in the administration because he knows it. Um, the Public Service Commission proves to be resistant to democratic control, so it's effectively an actor's pass, which basically significantly dismantles its power. Public Service Commission today has got no role in appointments and such. It doesn't even appoint its own administration. Though the chairperson technically appoints them. The committees that appoint are political committees, include ministers. So although it's established independently in terms of the constitution, its own officers are in fact politicized. So its control of them is actually quite attenuated. And it doesn't really have very broad powers. It can investigate that kind of thing. Can't punish. It has no teeth. And it can in fact issue like directives of various sorts, which it has practiced on some occasions. So most prominently in kind of late 2000s, it established a system for regulating conflicts of interest. Often produces quite interesting reports, but otherwise it's marginal to the American, to the South African administrative system. The way it actually works by this point, and this has a kind of longer legacy because partly P.W. Boyson, he started politicizing that breach of the administration, or certainly his prerogative of appointments, partly because the country was kind of falling apart in the administration. He was politicizing the situation. So there's a bit of a lead time on this factor. So in municipalities, people are starting to politicize the administration in various ways to end apartheid. So like a liberal element in these places in the 1980s. And it's kind of going ahead of the national situation. Right, so the way it works, a little bit longer lead time point I think for is it's quite elaborate actually. It actually has no real purpose. Is that the executive authority, which in the case of national departments, the director generals, are legally speaking appointed by the president. So the heads of the administration are presidential appointments. Sort of, because in terms of regulations, there needs to be a committee for the appointment of these positions. And that committee needs to include other ministers, it needs to include the minister that's in the portfolio, and it needs to include like another director general. And it basically makes a recommendation to the president. But that recommendation, in terms of cabinet directive, has to go to the cabinet. Right? So before the president makes a decision, the recommendation goes to the Minister of Public Service and Administration, who then passes on to cabinet. Cabinet decides whether it's okay or not. Usually they say it's okay. The actual place is somewhere out there, and then the president appoints legally, signs the contract and so on. In fact, partly this is all happening in deployment committees of the African National Congress. In that direction, but because it's actually so actually, and the president is cabinet. So actually, although it's supposed to be segregation of duties, so it's supposed to be check and balances between these committees, in outcome, because the president appoints everyone in that process, it's not actually a segregation of duties. A single person controls the whole thing, depending on his own personal power. Right? So can be constrained by powerful ministers who want their own person. That happens quite often. And by the top six of the ANC, by the deployment committee and so on. Where power lies in that process is actually quite contingent. And that system's replicated at provincial level very similarly, and in local government through different processes that involve council. In fact, from the portfolio committee, from the ministerial level, um, yeah, yeah, oh, this one I just lost it. So the portfolio committee, sorry, the ministerial head of a department, who in terms of public service act is the executive authority. They are the only appointing authority below the Director General. Right? So in fact, they have the power to appoint at any level across the administration. Right? Also, so but they put the selection. So there's not actually any check. Right? You might as well have it. They control the whole process, virtually, with some kind of intervention from ANC, whatever. So with that kind of broad thing in mind, I'll come back to it just now. Um, but when we get back, so we're going to take like a 5 minute break. We will. Some of the significance of this. Okay, so this is like briefly recap where we've come. Who here is like political scientists? Um, you guys learned like comparative method. Has anyone else learned comparative method as like an approach to things? Right. So I guess I should be kind of forthright again regarding the methodology involved. Yeah. Which is that basically, what I'm doing is taking long periods of time in different parts of the world and comparing. Um, so what that allows you to do is kind of is effectively isolate variables. So, say for example, in the perfect world, uh, if say two countries um, are similar in all relevant respects, and they have one variable or a small set of variables, let's say, that are different, then arguably by the comparative methodology, those differences explain different outcomes. You know? So, in our example, or in our concern here, if two countries are similar in a whole range of respects, like say Italy and Germany, but they're different in outcome, say Germany very limited scale of corruption, Italy in the 1990s, over 100 municipalities were disbanded on corruption allegations. Um, what explains that outcome? Right? So then you go looking for things where they're different. Which parts of their political order are different that explain these different outcomes. And so people do this kind of thing, and they have arrived at the conclusion that it's because Germany established a professional administrative stratum independent from political appointment before it democratized. Remember, Germany only got its first democracy after 1918. Um, whereas Italy did not. So it democratized before it bureaucratized. And hence, politicians, when they came into office in the democracy, weren't blocked in terms of interfering in the administration to gain a supply of patronage, which they could then use to build political support and win elections and so on. That kind of logic applies across the board, right? So let's say you have two countries that are very different from each other. Let's say Italy and South Africa. Um, but they have similar outcomes, very different in most relevant respects, but they're both countries with high levels of corruption. Um, South Africa collapsed 500 and disbanded 100 municipalities for corruption. So so what explains it? Italy is actually quite a wealthy country. It's a developed country. income levels probably about twice that of South Africa per capita. But similar levels of corruption. What explains it? Different in all important respects, but they share in common lack of insulation of administration in the right sorts of ways. So in South Africa, politicians can interfere in the administration, get us power patronage, and use that patronage for political support. Roughly that's what's going on here. That's how we figure out what are the crucial causal mechanisms that produce these outcomes. That apart at like kind of broader scale, because you can eliminate other variables like that. So like say you mentioned like party systems, right? So competitive elections produce less corrupt systems. The Italian electoral system is massively turnover quite often. Still high levels of corruption. That can't really. That's one of the ways. One variable is kind of been eliminated. Competitive elections have no necessary causal relation that reduce corruption levels. In fact, what we find is that very often, although statistically, when taken over like large ends, like say 100 countries, competitive elections tend to be less corrupt as far as we can measure these sorts of things. To some extent. So it's not a very strong correlation, but the correlation is there. At the same time, we know that competitive elections aren't a sufficient condition for very low levels of corruption, because there's so many countries that have competitive elections that are very corrupt. So, like through that kind of process, we've gone through in very broad sweeps, like a lot of history. So going back to the beginning, from the first times when states were built, we kind of traced that process and how it works, broad outline. And we've arrived at the kind of conclusion that in modern times, one thing that's strongly correlated with corruption or no corruption is the ways in which appointments, promotions, and dismissals are made within public administration. If they're made by an independent body, which say has security of tenure on the model of judges, that body will tend to appoint in such a way that administrators are not dependent on politicians for their career prospects, can't be dismissed without cause or put on precautionary suspension, as happens in South Africa, without good cause. This means that where politicians appoint and they control the career prospects and all that kind of thing, they can both appoint people that are politically connected to them and thereby bridge checks and balances in administrations, or where people are already appointed, they can threaten their job prospects. They can make life difficult for them through a whole range of vexatious instructions. They can ultimately suspend them without good cause, as often happens. In systems where there's independence, say where appointment happens to a civil service commission or there's a short list or that sort of thing, that sort of coordination is rendered much more difficult. Politicians, when they approach public servants that are set up in that kind of way with illicit deals, public servant needs to make a choice. They can't be forced to accept an illicit instruction. The politician doesn't have that kind of leverage on it. But they can strike a bargain, a corrupt bargain, and this happens. But the tendency is for that to be a lot more difficult. because public servants are not accountable to politicians for whatever they want. They're accountable on a different basis. They're accountable on the basis of their professional reputation. That's how they advance their careers. Legitimacy before the public. The rules and the sorts of accountability arrangements that they might fall foul of if they veto this. So the tendency in these sorts of systems is for public servants to be subject to a whole range of other imperatives, which means that they often, or more often, it's a kind of statistical proposition, act as a check upon politicians. Politicians may instruct, but if those instructions are illicit, if they're outside the rules, if they're illegal, then the public servant can say no, and the politician can't do much about it. And at the same time, public servants who are potentially corrupt, politicians who are not involved in that corruption, have a, or rather they aren't, they aren't benefiting. If there's administrative corruption that doesn't lead to the political class, then since the politicians aren't involved, they're not benefiting from that corruption. They're more likely to check that corruption. So to discipline the administration in all sorts of ways. So what I'm getting at is that in a system of independent public administration, what tends to happen is that politicians and administrators act as checks upon each other in support of the rules. It approaches to what we might call a self-enforcing mechanism. In South Africa, we kind of began to describe the system of appointments and the way it works. It's a system of limited requirements in terms of qualifications and such. They do exist. Most high levels, or actually, as far as I can tell, all of the first few layers of administrations, there are professional qualifications required. Often in the public service, in national, provincial, that is, the requirement is a bachelor's degree or higher, often relevant to the specific field. So we don't really have a problem of people that are entirely ill qualified. Very often they may not be precisely qualified for the particular work that they're doing. It happens. But generally in the public service, people are very highly educated, actually. Their degree, as a matter of law. But they are appointed from that point by a system which is controlled by politicians, by committees which are selected by politicians themselves as appointed voters. And so what you find is a number of things. Right? In the first instance, politicians appoint and promote and dismiss in such a way that bridges segregations of duties and enables them to pull resources out of the administration for patronage purposes. Additionally, since politicians are out there, they are subject to the kind of broader power of society. Their political position is often dependent upon much broader, political relations. They are often controlled by other people. And so what you get in these sorts of systems very often is the progressive externalization of appointed power, even beyond political office bearers. What's the most prominent example of this? The Guptas, in which effectively, as far as we've been able to tell, appointment decisions across broad swathes of the administration, or these important points that they had an interest in. The guys are sitting with a list of procurement plans, which have lists of potential contracts, and they there's the money. They pick and choose where they want to go, and they appoint accordingly. where so you get this situation which is it's not confined to the Guptas. The Guptas just took that to a national level. In fact, in local governments, it's a fairly pervasive circumstance. Appointments, promotions, dismissals, and so on are being decided on in places that we don't even know about. Outside the glare of public transparency and all that sort of thing. Without any kind of accountability arrangements involved, the person that makes the appointment is often not entirely clear. So you get that kind of dynamic, right? This kind of externalization of administrative decision making, and that elaborates, the way this kind of parallel state has what is technically referred to as patronage regime looks. In South African politics, there's a lot of attention to who gets contracts and such. A lot of decisions are made in, say, the institution of entrepreneurship, let's say. There's one of entrepreneurial searching for business opportunities in the state, often with kickbacks and so on. So, in many parts of the state, there is a fairly firmly institutionalized standard that say like 10% of the contract that you receive gets kicked back into the person that facilitates access to directly on the housing department. This is quite common. It can't just be personal relations like nepotism, that kind of stuff. But the thing empties out into a fairly sophisticated organization for pulling out the vote during election time. So if you say spend some time in Umlazi, Durban, is anyone from Umlazi? In Umlazi, which is, I'm just using this as an example, Umlazi is unique. Whatever contract or job opportunity offered by the state that happens to operate within a particular ward goes through a structure that's responsible for distributing those job opportunities and contracts. Now that might be the councillor, and it very often is. It might also be the chairperson of the branch, who might or might not. Might be the secretary of the branch. It could be someone else that just has political weight in the situation for various reasons. That person will have a list of people who are eligible for jobs, people who support the party, that do work during election time, that play the game, people that you might have family relation with, etc., etc. And they'll decide who gets contract, who gets a job. Usually this is at the subcontract. Which is to say, if you're a contractor, say you're fixing a curb, you're the main contractor, so you've tendered and all that kind of stuff. You can't start working on it unless you subcontract to local suppliers. In Durban, that's often incorporated as a kind of requirement in terms of the main contract. Even to the extent that in the main contract, the stipulation is that coordination will happen with what is called a community liaison officer to determine who gets contracts and all that kind of thing. Community liaison officer is a person that's appointed by the local power board. Branch secretary, councillor, usually it's the councillor, but the councillor may be controlled in those way. If the distribution of the contract isn't at a percentage that people like, then there may be mobilisation to kind of stop work on that project to get a higher percentage of the contract. Those local contractors will then also appoint political connections with family friends, that kind of stuff. Right? So there's a range of kind of distributed possibilities that emerge once a contract goes to a ward in Mlazi. If in Mlazi, as has happened, there is the emergence of a countervailing force, right? So, say there's a group of people that are unhappy that they've been living in shacks for 20 years, that they always get promised houses and never get them. Say they kind of mobilize and they fight a ward committee election, which has happened in a certain place in Nazi, they get 6 of the 10 ward committee positions. Right? So now they kind of control the ward committee. Um, the practice is twofold, right? The one is buy them off with contracts. Right? So there's a new group on the block. They're potentially problematic in terms of maintaining power. So you buy them off, you divide and rule in that fashion. In this case, 5 of the 6 were bought off, and one remained the only oppositional member on the ward committee. Not very effectual. In Umlazi, which is a little bit more violent than many places in South Africa, if that group of people decided not to take the contract, it's very common to be at least threatened with violence. More common to be threatened with violence. This is a common feature of patronage systems, right? Because patronage systems have no external mechanism of enforcement, in the sense that once you're involved in a series of corrupt exchanges, then those corrupt exchanges aren't enforceable by the court. And so partly for this reason, violence is a prominent feature of the enforcement of contract. A range of other reasons for it. So partly because politicized police services are not the best at partially enforcing the law, can avoid enforcement of your politically so space is provided for the elaboration of legal ways, legal means to achieve objectives. Contracts are generally kept small, right? So I mean, partly the main, if you're getting, say, in a place like Malasia, if you're getting government positions, that means you're almost like you've left the wall. The government's in Durban. It's not really, it's not like the business activity is happening in Malasia. When the state goes down to Malasia, it's for the most part by a contract. Contractors build houses, the state doesn't build houses. Contractors fix roads, the state doesn't do that. The state actually does very little. Even refuse removal and that kind of stuff is contracted out. So the state comes as a contractor. So contracts are the main kind of base of the patronage system. Contracts are in the South African system for various reasons. Short term, the Auditor General favours, as well as National Treasury favours, annual competitive tenders. And so each year the contract goes through a competitive tender. And given that there's such intense competition for most tenders, for most kind of like basic construction work in a place like Umlazi, you're probably going to get around 100 tenders. The chance that you're going to win out in a tender every single year when there's 100 is quite limited. There's political turnover, all that sort of thing. What this means is that contractors themselves tend to have very short-term perspectives. They're not really concerned with building the capacity that will allow them to win contracts over and over again, because partly they don't win contracts on the basis of capacity, they just win on the basis of price. So there's a kind of cutthroat competition race to the bottom. So nuance of the South African procurement system. they, for this kind of reason, partly because they winning contracts on the basis of political connections and such. Very little concern with kind of maintaining private sector capacity over long periods of time. Um, Lots of tension in tendering processes. Parts of South Africa tender boxes are bombed. Um, there's lots of pressure for these things. Um, and lots of turnover, therefore, in terms of who gets appointed, in terms of subcontracting, that kind of stuff, and also in terms of so that's a complicated question. Like often, there is some concern with delivery. Very often, nothing. Um, but things are not delivered otherwise. It's a bit of a mess. Kind of odd, but not quite. So we still have water, right? Sometimes. So stuff does happen, right? And certainly, especially kind of at the main contracting level, especially for kind of larger public works, um, this is there's kind of sustainable companies that do this. But very often it's like transit. Right? So people that have just tendered in low, they've got a political connection, they're just going to set up a. People tender with shelf companies. Right? So like you'd say you'd put in like say 5 tenders which are owned by the same person. You get different prices, so you're more confident kind of getting price quality, right cost quality ratio. These things don't exist. They're in a file, right? And there's the transit that's like gambling. Um, and you'd kind of set up some kind of vehicle for delivery. There certainly is very often pressure from politicians and from the administration to deliver. There's costs in terms of if you have promised that you're going to say fix the street lights, people struggle to walk at night, there's violence and such. People are going to be angry at you, right? And ultimately you do need to win elections. So there are these sorts of factors that kind of produce some resolution of the matter at a level of often very low capacity delivery, shoddy workmanship, lights that are from China that don't really integrate with the technology. There's all these sorts of things that happen. Um, but there are pressures to delivery. It's just that there's also a range of other pressures that mitigate effective delivery. How many tenders will be closed? What do you mean? No, that's impossible. Yeah, it is technically impossible. So, like, if we close the tender system, the whole South African public service would grind to a halt within a very short space of time. um, yeah. What's that? What's true? Well, it's true that tenders are going to be closed. What I said, okay. um, but also, like, no one really has authority to close all tenders. It's such a. I guess we're going into question.
And especially considering the fact that a lot of scholars and I guess some activists that are arguing that there's a need for transparency in as far as the tendering system is concerned.
Right.
So they said that they were not necessarily closing them, but they're just going to expose and they're just going to reform and change certain things.
When did this happen?
Uh, I heard it a couple of weeks ago.
A couple of weeks ago.
It's
So
very
you
recent.
probably, like, I've probably been following these. Like, I live in New York, so it's a little bit different. But,
Can I clarify what it is that they might be talking
right,
about?
right.
Which is not the abolishment of any kind of mechanism by which public service will be tendered and rendered, but the change of system from the current tender operation to an alternative system, which isn't being articulated. So that there would still be some process by which public service will be subjected to control and administration, just not the contemporary current operating tender system. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, so there's like the central supply database and the e-tender portal, the National Treasury, whereby everyone has to register, and that kind of stuff. So there may be like a migration plus system. You'll have to kind of follow up. But yeah, no way to kind of close tenders, and certainly they'd have to keep it like a very short time frame in which this happened. My sense is that all of this stuff happened like very seamlessly around 3 or 4 years ago, whereby anyone that's part of the state needs to register on the central supply database, they need to give tax forms and all that stuff, and no one, there was never a process of like closing general shutdown of tenders. That would be very problematic. So I'd imagine National Treasury, which is the only place that has the kind of the technical wherewithal to kind of close the tender system, would avoid that. And if they couldn't, then it would happen in a very short space of time. Okay, so like, I mean, we're kind of inching towards the end. Broadly speaking,
We'll begin here. Do these 3 questions. You can answer them, and then I'll come back to you. And was there another question there somewhere? Okay, so we'll do 3 questions here. Follow that up with the next round.
Okay, so my first question, it was when you started and you were defining what exactly corruption is.
right?
So I just want to know, so say Cyril Ramaphosa and me, we both stole money, will we be prosecuted the same way, given that his position is he's a president, regardless of how we did it, but let's just say we stole an equal amount of money, will we be prosecuted the same way for theft?
Not in South Africa, no. So in South Africa, what would happen is there'd be around 8 years of intense struggle between the president and broad sections of society, which would lead ultimately to the point where people would take to the streets. They'd get to a point where there's fires on the lawns of union buildings and so on, and then ultimately there'd be some kind of political process to remove the president, and he may or may not be prosecuted in not too distant future because he's powerful.
And then my second
But
question,
legally speaking, so that law should be treated equally. But like in practice, kind of loosen that up a bit.
which is like why I was asking that question. I mean, I don't think we should be treated equally because he's a president and he used that position. So he should be prosecuted more. I mean,
No,
for
he
the
should be
fact,
prosecuted more.
yeah, he should get like more harsh conditions because he used his
Yeah, I mean,
position
so-
in which
so, like-
people trusted him with.
I mean, there is some leeway for like judges and sentencing to say that there's aggravating circumstances like that, people placed in more trust in them and such. So that might even be a factor. Yeah.
And I'm
But
just
in
gonna
practice, he's
ask.
probably not going to be prosecuted.
So I'm gonna ask my last 2 questions
Yeah,
before
yeah.
I get an answer. So my second question was, you said politics is usually used as a weapon against other political enemies.
You mean prosecutions uses.
No, politics. You said
Huh?
they use it. Politics. Politicians. They will use their position as weapons against their political enemies.
Yeah, always.
So my question
You'd be
around
a
that
bad
is.
politician if you didn't.
So my question around that is it always the earlier intention for them to use it as a political weapon against their political enemies instead of just using it for self-gain? Before they get
I think
into politics, when they're still in the process.
I mean, it's a very abstract question, right? In the sense that, certainly there's like lots of official roles in which people don't weaponize them. But like, like also a political weapon is a very broad notion. Right? So like, say, a speech before Parliament, say the State of the Nation address, is partly a political weapon. Right? It's meant to kind of build power for oneself and undermine the position of one's opponent. So very broadly, this is what politics is kind of all about, right? It's that people are gaining positions of power and they're using that power to gain more power and to undermine the power of their enemies. Yeah.
My last question. So, it was going to be about tenders, but I think that's already. So this question is about voting systems. So is there a certain number of people that are supposed to vote within a population in order for whichever political party wins, in order for it to be say this is the legal political party that won. So say 10% of the population was the only people to participate in voting,
Right.
and ANC won. Will they still be recognized as like the people who won, like
I
the
mean, probably border society would say like that their electoral legitimacy is a little bit attenuated, given that they won on the basis of say 60% of the vote. So what you'd imagine in those circumstances, which are, so we have a South African example of that, right? So in black local authorities during the dying days of apartheid, there were elections. Those elections were generally the attendance or the kind of the voting population was generally like 10% of the general population. So, like black local authorities were generally considered to be illegitimate institutions, hence their low participation rate and so on. So you're probably, if you're getting down to 10% of the vote, you're probably headed towards kind of illegitimate black local voting territory. But in terms of the constitution, it'd still be a sort of take it forward. The constitution doesn't specify a low limit for participation in voting. Yeah. So, so what I'd argue is that what's necessary. I didn't really get to that, and I should have. I kind of ran out of time. Let's take national government. Right? So at national government, there's director general, and there's director generals, and there's deputy director generals, right? In every department. Um, those are now appointed by political leadership. So the president and the president appoints minister. What ought to happen, and in my view, this is by far the most effective mechanism we would have against the corruption problem, is appointment processes for those positions ought to be placed in the Public Service Commission. The Public Service Commission is a really complicated body in terms of its constitution, but ultimately Parliament appoints 5 members to the Public Service Commission, 6, anyway, something along those lines. And the president appoints, and the provincial parliaments appoint 1 each. So there's a kind of a balance in favour of the province. Big part of it. And then they've got tenure, and they can't be removed except for this kind of judgment in that respect. Which is about as independent as you can get in the South African constitutional system. They should control those appointments to the first and second levels, director generals and deputy director generals, and they should control it until they shortlist, say, 3 people, and then the political leadership can decide from those 3. The minister should decide, not the president. The minister should decide from those 3 who to appoint. So what that provides for is a measure of political say. In appointing people that are seen as politically appropriate, not resistant to the government's agenda and all that sort of thing. But it also pretty thoroughly disrupts the ability of politicians to just appoint who they please their political connections. And from that point to, the way it works is that appointments are made to director general and deputy director general level, and the delegations are usually made to human resources functions, but then those are politicized. In this kind of system, the first two layers, so the Director General and say 4 or 5 people below him or her, would be appointed by the Public Service Commission or through separate processes. So they'd often come from very different walks of life. They would be fairly non-political in the sense that this is a career for them, and the politician wouldn't be able to appoint who they see fit. So that those layers would act as kind of checks upon each other, right? Because they're not on the same clique. They might form a clique, but the chances are more limited. And then there ought to be appointments further down. That ought to go into the office of the Director General, who should be forced to appoint through committees that include people say head of human resources and the head of the department that the person is be appointed to. So as far as I can tell, that's the way it works. That's the best mechanism that we know about for achieving what you seem to want to. No, the legislation gives all powers of appointment to the political leadership. The Public Service Commission plays no role. It has no powers of appointment. That's just that's in terms of the Public Service Act. So the Public Service Act needs to be a new act. That act is dated. It was written for a particular moment in South African history where it was justifiable to be because the apartheid administration could have been trusted. But that rationale no longer exists, and no one made an argument for the system for the last 20 years. And then, of course, precautionary suspensions ought to be approved by the Public Service Commission for these 2 layers, and for the Director General and so on.
So I think what was just asked was kind of covered, because at first I was going to ask how this seems to be more of a political, cultural issue that probably needs regulating. I think you listed some of your own opinions on how it can be regulated, but one thing that I was going to propose, you can, I don't know your opinion on, yeah, please give me your opinion on it, is with the Public Service Commission, should there not possibly be a protection in Chapter 9 of the Constitution, ensuring that it is independently monitored from political parties and government, to ensure that the Public Service Commission and therefore civil servants are properly hired and monitored and held accountable independently from what government, and therefore.
So, I mean, there's a section of the Constitution that deals with the Public Service Commission. There's a constitutional body, not in Section 9, it's Chapter 10, or not in Chapter 9, Chapter 10, slightly after. And it does constitute it as an independent body. It prohibits interference in its operations, and so on. The Public Service Commission Act creates, makes it an offence punishable by fines and such to interfere in the operation of this commission. It is supposed to kind of play the role of ensuring that appointments occur on the basis of merit and all that kind of stuff, and it does kind of publish reports that basically say that this is not happening. It is kind of often brought into investigations to this effect, but it can't do anything. It's got no power to do anything. So it's a toothless body. So I'm reluctant to change the Constitution. If I could, I would. But I think it's too solid. But I think the Public Service Commission Act needs to be, certainly that needs to be changed alongside the Public Service Act. Public Service Commission Act. Sure.
For me, I would like to stand to be corrected if I'm wrong. So I think as a country we are controlled by politics more than we are controlled by the constitution or the parliament or whatever. For example, our president Ramaphosa is representing ANC, and ANC is the organization, a political organization that has its mandate, manifesto, policy, or yeah, everything. So my question is that then if Ramaphosa and everyone who is in highest leading position are not delivering. So, as a community, who should we hold accountable? Should we hold ANC accountable or just Ramaphosa and the individuals? And my second question is that um, the way politics operates, do you think it is for the best of the country or we are just moving backward? And my last question is about tender system. What do you think about the tender system that is running like now? And if it's good for you, then why do we have so much corruption and yeah, and the lack of service delivery for the community? And if it's bad, then what new ideas we can come up with to have a smooth operation and the right delivery service for the community?
So unlike government, we're going to have to change gears because these are three questions. I think respond to them before we go there.
So, as kind of voters and people that don't have our hands in the administration or the prosecutorial authority over there, our only option is to hold the ANC to account. Because we don't directly elect Ramaphosa. Ramaphosa is elected by, or he's appointed, he's put on the list by the ANC and then he's elected by Parliament in the Constitution. So, South Africa has very limited opportunity for, just in terms of the constitutional system as well as the Electoral Act, very limited opportunity for holding individuals to account. The only individuals that ever get held to account by the citizenry from this angle is councillors, ward councillors, that only directly elected politicians. Certainly, in terms of public opinion, we do hold individuals to account. So, for example, Jacob Zuma is massively unpopular as far as any polls that we have suggest, and partly it seems reasonably clear that the ANC was at risk of losing the election just because people don't like Zuma. So in that sense, there's a kind of effect in which very powerful politicians in the ANC do register in public opinion and are held to account in that kind of way. But that's always kind of via the political party as a whole. So are we moving backwards? No, I think we're moving forwards. I think there's like a window of opportunity. It could have gotten quite bad. All indications were that in kind of late Zuma years, we were headed down a path that would have, on kind of comparative experience, issued in a kind of some measure of a kind of authoritarian resolution of a popular kind of revolt at bad economic conditions and state collapse, these sorts of things. So things could have got very bad, but unlike many countries in a kind of post-independent situation, South Africa kind of self-corrected itself. So under Ramaphosa, reform-minded president, offers very little in terms of broader kind of socio-economic changes. It's very very sensitive respects, but state. That provides kind of window of opportunity to get a handle on those sorts of problems. My sense is that from what I've seen, seems to be like South Africa hasn't really kind of approached this kind of problem before. There's a kind of path dependency an established pattern of thinking, let's say, which means that people approach, in my view, the kind of corruption problem in a very naive way. Um, I think, for example, the focus on prosecutions is a big mistake, and if we continue to do that, we will miss this opportunity. And then, once Ramaphosa's out, it's not clear what might happen. So that would be like my broad analysis of that. The tender system, my view is actually quite different from most people's views. I think the real problem is that we're too focused on integrity in the tender system. What's been happening over the last 10, 20 years is that the regulators in National Treasury have been kind of like tightening procedure, and in the auditor general in terms of interpretation, they've been like tightening the way public procurement works. And what that's done is it's almost like there's corruption on one side, which is very often inefficient and so on. But then you've got these regulators that are approaching this thing in such a way that it's creating more inefficiencies in terms of procurement decision making. The focus on annual competitive tender, like I suggested before, is I think creates cycles of destruction of private sector capacity. In my view, where this procurement system needs to go, and certainly people in National Treasury have kind of begun to think in the same way, is we need to have a more targeted, a more direct approach to public procurement. So people just need to justify in writing, and then they can tender with people who they want to tender with. Those contracts ought to be longer term. They should be oriented around using public procurement to industrialize, to build kind of value in sectors that are developmental. There's ways in which, so I think like the purchasing stage ought to be loosened up a bit, and the focus should really be on the kind of strategizing things, how you're going to buy, what you're buying for, that kind of thing, and what you do with procurement. Then also the contract management phase. So once a contract is entered into, what we find is that the contract management phase is entirely loose. Often problems arise there. I don't mind if personally, if I were to do a kind of second best approach to things, I'd say I don't really care if people get a tender that's corrupt. I just care that they deliver, they build capacity, that kind of thing. And so there's ways in which you can bolster up contract management, partly by changing process and all that kind of thing, but also by what I'm very much in favour of is. It's a complicated process, but I want to give people bounties if they can evidence fraud before a court. So I want to incentivize whistleblowers and such to approach courts with evidence of corruption, and especially in the contract management phase. So double invoicing for things that haven't been provided, shoddy workmanship, that kind of thing. I want to say that if you get found guilty of that in a civil claim, so on the balance of probabilities, you have to pay double damages to the state, so double damages of what this cost. I want to give 30% of those double damages or something along those lines to the people that brought evidence before the court. And then that's a mechanism that's been very effective in other countries. So that's my position on that.
My question is with regards to the public protector. I want to know if your institute works with her when she submits her findings or before that, and how do we hold her accountable? Do we hold her accountable as an individual or as the entire office of the public protector?
No, we've never worked with the public protector. The public protector does their own thing. Certainly, this public protector may be quite difficult to work with. I've had conversations with her before. I mean, the old public protector, not really this one. I think the office of the public protector has been very useful. I think it's a great idea. So I wouldn't change very much about the way it's constituted. I also think that the present public protector is, she's clearly operating according to a political agenda on very flimsy legal basis, and I think there's by now sufficient grounds for the removal. Um, and my sense is that that will probably happen in the not too distant future. Yeah, I mean, so like you can't have a person in that kind of office that's using it as a political weapon against factions rather than national projects. Yeah, so that's I guess my view. What you mean bureaucracy? Uh, okay. So yeah, I mean, I guess I'm using like bureaucracy, not the best term. So like I'm using a particular notion of democracy. I'm supporting some, actually not really supporting others. So there is an argument that over-regulation of spaces kind of forces people to break the rules. Um, Certainly, that happens in South African public procurement. Uh, some portion of irregular expenditure, as noted by the Auditor General, is just people that are trying to do something that the rules don't allow, but that the thing they're trying to do is actually good and in the public interest and all that kind of thing. Like I said, like I favour loosening the rules of public procurement. I think it should be easier to contract to deliver houses. Um, I'm actually in favour very often of kind of deregulating. Um, I only want rules to be placed in like the right places that actually works. And so, I'm sensitive to kind of the extent to which rules create inefficiency, but also create incentives for kind of for irregularity and corruption and so on. And also, often if the state has kind of like regulatory power, that also kind of incentivizes the public sector to provide people, so on. Like say in South Africa, I think that I think that we had too much recourse to the rules. Um, I think that whatever rules we create aren't going to be enforced anyway. Where there's political power that can prevent that kind of thing. So what you find is that a lot of like professional administrators that are keen to get themselves done in a public way, um, they are kind of trained and rendered inefficient by all these rules, and then people that have no public interest in mind just don't need to follow them. They're politically connected in the right places. So I think that's a weak response to the kind of corruption problem Mr. Cables. And instead, we want to reallocate power, particular powers of appointment, promotions, and set people up checks, so on. Prosecution as a mistake. I mean, so I think that, like I said at the outset, prosecution is undoubtedly and always an important feature of every anti-corruption drive. But I think it's very problematic to focus on prosecution as the only way to resolve corruption. And the reason is that there's no evidence anywhere in the world that prosecution by itself can resolve the corruption problem on this kind of scale. And the reasons for that are myriad, right? So prosecutions are costly, they take time, people get bored, people start demanding popular justice, which can lead to authoritarian outcomes. Politicians adapt, they end up breaking institutions in the process, they criticize the judiciary and the prosecution, etc. So I think it's a weak mechanism. And it's a mechanism that, when it's kind of centered in the way it has been in South Africa, can produce pretty severe adverse consequences. Yeah.
Hi. Most of the things that you're saying are true. I remember a few, maybe 2, 3 years back, I witnessed some sort of like a corruption, but then back then I didn't know it was corruption. So I attended a tender briefing, you see. So it was for to build a tar road. So I was invited. So like, okay, let's go for a tender briefing. Get there. When I get there, I was told that I represent some sort of like a company that was bidding for that tender, only to find out that it, there were there were two different names, but then they all belong to the same person. So my question is, when it comes to tender briefings and tender allocations and all that, what's the criteria of of a person being awarded a tender, and is there a difference between, in terms of criteria, of building, let's say, a road or a government facility or something along those lines? Is there a criteria, and is there any difference when it comes to that? And then, in terms of, because when it happens, in most cases it's regional. So when it comes to accountability, do we go to the regional municipality, or is it the provincial municipality? Thank you.
So so what are the values? I can't remember the values now, but like I say, if it's about 500,000 rand, the expected value of the contract, then it ought to go out on a competitive tender, which entails that before it goes on and tender, specifications to be thought. Right? So what is the state buying? Right? That includes like quality and all that kind of stuff. The roads need to be of a certain substance, they need to be of a certain size, certain length, etc., etc. Paint needs to be applied to the eye. So, that's like the main criteria in the specification. To win a tender, you need to have like a tax certificate that says that you're like in good standard of SARS. You often need a kind of BE accreditation, and something I'm missing, but that's basically the setup. And then when you contract, there'll be like a general conditions of contract, and the specifications will be included into like the additional conditions of contract, and so on. So all good. The tender process is basically, we operate in what's called like a 90-10, 80-20 system. So I think what the Zuma did is they pushed up if the contract is above 50 million, then in the public service, then it becomes a 90-10 system. So basically it's a point system. So 90% of the points sense, goes to tribes. Right? So they basically calculate the cost of that, and then 3% goes to which include like disability, women, that kind of stuff. And then they add together, and then whoever gets the most points wins. Whoever gets the lowest points. And then there's the 80-20, which is below 55. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so like there's a whole range of guidelines that are published by the Department of Trade and Industry, um, which basically says that you need to achieve certain like standards to be in a certain grade. Right? So that includes the ownership of the business, black, woman, disabled, and it includes um, ownership of the business like subcontracting. So you can be small by subcontracting in that business. It's management, so you get BE score from the number of black managers, um, BE score from training opportunities that you provide, as well as like social investment kind of stuff. To say, you contribute money to a school, something along those lines, this can count as then they add it all up and get a grade, grades on a number scale, and so on. Like the prosecuting authority is working. Prosecutions happen, obviously, but its ability to kind of prosecute complex corruption cases is by this point quite limited. Basically, like when Zuma came in and politicized, a lot of people left, and so they don't have the same kind of prosecutorial capacity that they had. Um, it's also, that's the case also further down the kind of prosecutorial value chain. Um, the Hawks are broken and heavily politicized. Prosecuting authority also still has political appointments. It will take a while to work through them, or to like work them out of the system. The police, fairly limited investigative capacity as regards corruption at this point. Also heavily politicized. So partly why the kind of focus on prosecution isn't such a great idea is that firstly, it's going to take time to get this whole system moving again. And also, it's just a weak mechanism, so you can pay some attention to other measures. In terms of like holding councillors accountable and all that kind of stuff, like I said, it's kind of like a lot of it's public opinion based, like the raising of scandals by the news media and all that kind of stuff, which the ANC isn't entirely unresponsive to. So if when scandals emerge, someone's kind of political stature is diminished in South Africa. Um, in rural areas, not so much because there's not really much news media to speak of. The visibility of those places in terms of public opinion is quite limited. Um, so they tend to kind of drop off the map. And yeah, so then I guess the mechanism is electoral. So voting them out of power, and also kind of internal ANC kind of factional, you could say, in terms of the ANC zoning mechanism. Um, yeah, that's kind of what you got to work with. Um, yeah, but I think we're turning the corner. I don't think we're going backwards.